Okay, 8.1, Introduction to Psychological Disorders. The objective for today is that students will be able to explain what constitutes a psychological disorder and how that plays a role in the legal system. Okay, so the definition for psychological disorder is any pattern of thought feelings or behaviors that are deviant, distressful, and what we would call dysfunctional. So as you can see, this definition could really mean a lot of things. If you think about what is your version of deviant, what is your version of distressful, and what is your version of dysfunctional, could mean different things to different people, which can cause some conflict over what actually is considered a psychological disorder. But we have 4 basic ways of looking at what causes a psychological disorder. So we have the biological approach is the first one, also known as the medical model. And the medical model essentially identifies a psychological disorder as a mental illness. Oops, sorry. Okay, let's try that one more time. The medical model calls mental disorders a mental illness that can be diagnosed from symptoms and cured with therapy. We should say and treated. Now, the psychological approach takes a little bit of a different viewpoint. The psychological approach says that you have experiences thoughts, emotions, and personality characteristics that essentially create psychological disorders. Sociocultural says the reason for psychological disorders is the society with which we live in. And then we have the biopsychosocial, which does 2 things. It looks at essentially nature and nurture and nurture. As well as cultural influences. It also would take a look at the vulnerability stress hypothesis, or the diathesis stress. We took this in class. And it is how vulnerable you are to stress. So again, when we take a look at this, what are the causes of the psychological disorder? We look at the biological approach, the psychological approach, the sociocultural approach, and then finally the biopsychosocial approach. The DSM-5 is a book that we use to identify and diagnose mental disorders. So they do this on a set of 4 axes. The first axis they take a look at is a clinical syndrome present? So is there some sort of syndrome present? So they could go through a checklist and they can check many or none from the list. So that's the first thing they do. So they listen to all your symptoms. So essentially what this is what are the symptoms? And do they fit into any disorder? So then after that, they're going to take a look at access to. Is a personality disorder or mental retardation present? So they're going to take a look as if is there anything else going on that they need to be aware of. So is there any other psychological concern? Is a general medical condition such as diabetes, hypertension, or arthritis also present? So now we're going to take a look at physical symptoms. Because those, could impact your psychological well-being. Axis 4 are psychosocial or environmental problems, such as school or housing issues, also present. So these social issues can impact your psychological well-being. And then axis 5, what is the global assessment of this person's functioning? So this is going to be on a scale of 0 to 100 to determine how well they can function. Now, on the flip side of this, you have a lot of people that criticize this and say it's too limiting, or that it can be too specific and that it doesn't really incorporate everything. We had Peterson and Seligman who developed what we call the Diagnostic Manual of Human Strength. And that does exactly what it sounds like. It takes a look at human strengths and how does that help us address psychological issues. So again, there's some critics of the DSM-4, and now it's actually the DSM-5 is a new one. The Rosenhan study happened in 1973, where you had Dr. Rosenhan said he was hearing voices. To be admitted into a psych ward. Essentially, after he was admitted, began acting normally, but was still being treated. And this was a huge problem, right? Here he is saying, oh, I don't hear those voices anymore, but they're still treating him. And so that led to major reforms in psychiatric hospitals. The second part of this is self-fulfilling prophecy, and this is where I think, therefore I am. And so the idea being here is that if someone tells them they were depressed, they may act depressed. And think they're depressed. So what constitutes a psychological disorder? Well, historically, it was believed that anyone who was quote unquote abnormal had a psychological disorder. And what was scary about this is that anyone could say that you were abnormal. It didn't have to be any specific diagnosis. There was no DSM book. There was nothing specific. You could just say this person is abnormal and therefore should be institutionalized. And in some cases, that was all it would take. But something fascinating, just kind of a fun fact to know, is that the first hospital to treat what they called at that point in time madness was in Baghdad in 705. And that fascinates me that long ago, they knew enough or had enough wherewithal to have a hospital for people who are struggling psychologically. Currently, it is viewed as any significant disturbance that can lead to dysfunction. So essentially, if it's not bothering you and you can still function in life normally, then it may not be considered a psychological disorder. But if it's causing you significant disturbance and you can't function in a normal life, then that could be considered a psychological disorder. And then really quickly, we've all seen this, psychology and the legal system. How exactly does this work? The insanity defense is not a psychological term. It is a legal term, meaning that you can't say that somebody is insane as a psychological diagnosis, but they say it as a legal term. Confidentiality. So you and your therapist have confidentiality. However, they are what we call a mandated reporter. Meaning, if you threaten to harm yourself or others. They are required by law to report. And that also includes abuse. So, although yes, you can tell your therapist all the things you want to, but if you tell your therapist that you want to hurt yourself or somebody else, then they are required to report that. And that is it for today.